said just they give him a few moments to get the sound turned on. There he is. Just a second. Yeah. I'll come a little closer. He wants me to have this on too. So. That's what he said. That's what somebody else said.
Yes, test, 1, 2, 3. We're good? Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Scott Langston. I am Texas Christian University's Native American Nations and Communities Liaison, and it's my honor to introduce to you Joshua Arce. Let me tell you a little bit about his background. Joshua is from the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, and he has 20 plus years experience in business, education management, and social work. He became CEO of Partnership with Native Americans in 2020, and that is one of the largest Native-led nonprofits in the country. He did this after serving on their board. He is a Native thought leader, and he helps organizations become more Native aware and engaged as change agents. He has a rich history of social work in his home state of Kansas. He served as guardian ad litem for tribal kids in the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation District Court. He was the tribal representative for the Kansas Citizen Review Panel, the Children in Need of Care case reviewer for Douglas County Citizen Review Board, and he was or is a Lutheran Indian Ministries board member. Am is. R. Today he's on the Texas Native Health Board, which is located in Dallas, and he is also a part of the University of Texas at Arlington Native Advisory Council. And I should also add that he's helping us out a lot at TCU as well. He holds a BA in social work and a JD in tribal law and leadership from the University of Kansas. And then I would just add personally is that I've known Joshua for a few years now, and I've come to respect him greatly. I've learned a lot from him, and I think we're all in for a treat and an education in the next few minutes. Joshua and I just had lunch, and we had a very stimulating conversation in which I learned a lot from him. So the way this will run is Joshua is going to speak, and then towards the end of the session, we'll have time for question and answer, and that'll take us up to the next session there. Joshua.
Thank you. So hopefully this picks me up okay, and I can move around. I'll have to come a little bit closer to talk with you guys. But thank you for coming today. Thank you for being here. Okay. So to start off with, there is a very rich story that goes along with this vest. It was one of the elders in our tribes, in one of my tribes, and so he was an extended relative for me. He was an uncle for me. And I was sharing this story a little bit earlier with Scott at lunch. He would go to various churches and denominations. So he would go to a Native American church. He would practice our traditional drum services and drum religion. He would go to Our Lady of the Snows Catholic Church. He would go to the Christian denomination church that were all near our reservation. And his name is Maynard Potts. And he would say, Maynard, why do you go to all these different places? Why don't you just pick one and just go there? And he said, because, as Native people, we're prayerful people. So we want to immerse ourselves in prayer, and we're a pitiful people, and we need as much prayer as possible. And so he didn't see the kind of the formal constructs of some of those institutions as limiting his ability to pray. He wanted to be able to make sure he had a presence across a lot of different areas and stay in prayer throughout his life. So very early, this was probably, I think it was in 2008, he passed. And it was a huge impact on our community because he was so revered because he was at all these different prayer things. So he was viewed as somebody very wise, spiritual, and somebody that people went to for counsel and looked up to and tried to emulate because of the way he lived his life. But he passed, and at that time I was going through some changes in my own life, and I recently started practicing sobriety. And so I got sober in March of 2008. Just about a month later, he had passed. So in April of 2008, it was his ceremony and services. And so I went there, and this was at the same time as a national championship game. So we had the University of Kansas playing Memphis in the national championship game, which was basically a huge party in downtown Lawrence. And in my heart of hearts, I knew that I needed to go to this prayer service. And it was just about a month to the day that prayer service was. And I was still very fresh in recovery and sobriety, and I was really nervous because I didn't want to miss out, fear of missing out. I was going to miss out on the big party. But I committed to going to the prayer service to honor this great man that was so influential to my tribe and to so many others in our community. And so it was a long service. Like, I didn't even get to see the game. I've watched it several times on rebroadcast, but I didn't get to see it. I missed the entire game. By the time I got back to Lawrence, they were already celebrating. They were already, the parade was already downtown, and I avoided it. Like, I didn't go near it. And I've been sober 15 years since. So from that, it was one of those experiences where I knew I was in the right place. And his family gifted me this vest after that event because, we have our prayer in our traditional way, and laying somebody to rest in ceremony services. It's really a hard prayer. It's a lot of dancing, it's singing, and so you just really pray hard for those people. And they honored me by giving me this vest. But one of the other things that when I was on my way home that night, I also got a phone call from my barber. And my barber had called me and said, "Hey, you won." And I was like, "Larry, what are you talking about?" He says, "Well, you had bought a ticket for an auction item at the barbershop, and you won." I said, "Okay, so what did I win?" And it's about a foot square piece of basketball floor signed by all of the KU Jayhawks from the 2008 national championship team. So I really felt like that was a start on my journey of really going in the right direction and doing that 180 where I turned from my ways of the youth and tried to turn into the ways of an adult and putting my past behind me. So that's kind of the story of this vest and that historical component of it. So thank you for asking. I love sharing that story. It's a great way to think about Maynard. A little bit about me. Again, Scott mentioned this, and I won't spend too much time on it. If you have any other questions or want more information, I'm sure they can get you this information. Having worked at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence, Kansas, it is a federally funded tribal college. So under our historically black colleges and universities, the HBCUs, there's a TCU umbrella, and not the TCU that Scott's talking about, but a tribal colleges and universities umbrella. And there's 37 tribal colleges that are underneath that umbrella, like HBCUs. So they're separate, but there's 37 of them. Haskell is the largest in the country. It is also located off reservation in Lawrence, Kansas, so it shares the town with the University of Kansas. A little bit about my social work and volunteerism. I've always had a heart for working with the youth. I've always enjoyed working with kids. Even when I got here, I really tried to get my feet under me. I moved here in January of 2020, so just before pandemic, and I reached out to what I knew and what I enjoyed, which was college campuses. Having worked for the previous 12 years at a university setting, I really enjoyed working with young people. And so I reached out to Scott. I reached out to people at UTA, SMU, UNT, really to get plugged into the Native community, because that's really where I was comfortable with. So we talk about sharing our time, talents, treasures, ties. That's where I wanted to be tied into, was the young people and the colleges again. So a little bit about PWNA, and I don't know if I can go back or not. So partnership with Native Americans, as Scott mentioned, we are, our umbrella organization covers 9 states. So we're located in the Southwest and Northern Plains. Our home offices are here, HR, IT, finance, kind of the back of the house stuff. But where we do the bulk of our work is out of Phoenix, Arizona, and Rapid City, South Dakota. And from those 2 cities, we have a hub and spoke model where we get out to the reservation communities. So we serve 4 states in the Northern Plains, 5 states in the Southwest. Those warehouses are about 40,000 square foot each. And so they're kind of like a mini Costco, where we have racks and stacks of different types of product that we're able to get out to the community. And we work with program partners. So our program partners are anywhere between elder nutrition clinics, early childhood education centers, and domestic violence shelters. Those types are program partners. We make deliveries to them in order to help them facilitate their services. So today we're going to talk a little bit about tribal health equity, some of the factors and policies affecting tribal health, the role of nutrition in tribal health, and how we help that. So this is something we've been working with an organization called Vitalist, and they are out of Vitalist Health Foundation. They're out of Arizona, but they put a lot of time and thought into this tribal health wheel. Now, one of the reasons why this is important, not just to me, but as this example for today, is I wanted to show how this was actually more dynamic. So traditionally, we see our medicine wheel approach, where you've got your 4 quadrants, kind of your more or less your spiritual, emotional, mental, physical components, and it's very kind of black and white. It's kind of a black-white or a black-red-yellow kind of a mix, but it's very, in some ways, I think of it as it's very rigid, or it's stuck. I see us as being a more, and this is a more accurate example. So around here, in the core of it, we have our elements of a healthy tribal community. And that's where we see that social, spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical. And then the next ring is family. The next ring is community. These 2 outer rings are also important. They also have the other items that are important to having. We look at these from that social determinants of health perspective, but they also important to having a healthy tribal community, and these different elements that are some ways unique to tribal communities that are on the outside. But it's also marked by different, like the stars, the moons, the sun, and the skies. And so these different elements are brought in to help represent tribal communities in a way that isn't as stagnant or as stuck. I see this as us being more complex people. And so what happens is this moves. So when we talk about food access, this makes it more dynamic in who we are as people, as Native people. And so food access can be tied to that beliefs and spirituality component. Access to food is critically important in that sense of growing and the stories and the lessons and the learnings that go along with growing your food or hunting your own food. We have some of our tribal program partners that are establishing their own slaughterhouses, for lack of a better terms, their own butchers, and they're doing it in a more humane way, so that way there's less animal trauma that's involved with that, and the processing of those meat and foods are more consistent with traditional practices. Instead of losing all of that culture and knowledge and history, they're actually able to revitalize that. But in the same instance, with food access, it does play a component of sovereignty and tribal governance. If a tribe, and there's this example that an elder used that said, we're not truly sovereign unless our food's sovereign. And so are we growing our own food? Do we know where it came from? Are we aware of what was put on it and before we ingest it, how it was treated? And so there are emerging programs in a tribal sovereignty governance perspective that directly impact food access. And so that way there isn't a consistent, wholly reliant dependency created on government food, on commodity programs, and those types of things out there. Again, the self-determination component. The communities that we work with are largely rural, remote reservation communities. And so they're not the ones that have easy access to an HEB and a Kroger, and whichever foods that are available, Whole Foods, but the self-determination to say what we're going to have as far as food access, who is going to be our distributor, who's going to be our wholesaler, where can we access those foods. And so it's important to empower the communities in order to have the control over what they are putting in their bodies. And then resiliency and way of life. So some of the communities that we work with have recently started doing their food reclamation, and they have seed banks. And so they've been able to bring back crops, corns, squashes that haven't been in their communities for decades because of these access to seed banks. And so you have this process where a community garden has grown San Carlos Apache, king sugarcane, and they've grown these melons, and the elders see them and are like, we haven't had these since we were kids. We haven't even seen these around since we were kids. And so the fact that they're able to bring that back into their way of life is a real victory for them, and that's where they're taking control over what they're putting in their body, and they're able to produce those fruits. So that was a little bit about the tribal health wheel. Get back to my program. Hopefully I didn't go between too many programs. Maybe I did. Okay. So if we're looking back and talking about different policies that impacted health, throughout history there have been multiple acts or policies that have been put in place by the federal government, and they do have these overarching impacts on Native health. More recently, we have the Self-Determination Act and the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. Again, those are something that happened some more current, obviously within the past 50 years, types of policies that impact the health of Native people. And really coming out of that Self-Determination Act, it kind of aligns with, and I've shared this with Scott before too, this thread of Native history is often interbound with American history, or intertwined with American history. And so the same time that the civil rights movement was taking place, there were also these movements in Indian country for self-determination. Tribal colleges was the birth of that movement as well. There was the Clean Water Act that also existed, the LIHEAP Act, the Agricultural Improvement Act, and all of these various things were, in this era, were definitely made to improve the conditions for Native people in Indian country. All of these were in some ways trying to help correct some of the problems or ills that had happened previously. You know, the Clean Water Act, as we all know, water is becoming one of the scarcest resources. It's especially in the Southwest. For a number of the Native communities that we serve that are Navajo or reservation communities, they're still impacted by the mines that were in existence. There's a uranium mines. If anybody saw the, what was the blockbuster hit over the summer about the Oppenheimer. You know, I think the Oppenheimer movie had a real opportunity to discuss the impact that not just that had on you know, the nation, but also what happened here at home with some of our Native communities. But the cleanup there is still in existence. You know, the DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline, which is in going through North Dakota, South Dakota, those types of cleanups, all of those are continuous issues in Indian country, and anytime that water is going downstream, it's going to impact those communities. And so with the mining situation, there ends up being these cancer clusters that are located in the communities and these trailing piles that still exist, and they were never cleaned up. But the tribes do have a ability through the EPA to implement higher water quality standards, which are definitely important. In a lot of ways, the Water is Life movement was impacted by this. Very early on, that Indian Civilization Act, and even through the U.S. Citizenship Act in 1924, you know, Native Americans didn't become citizens of the United States until 1924. And so that was you know, obviously a lot of history has happened up till that point, and most people don't realize that it took that long before Native Americans were granted citizenship. ICWA is currently in place, and again, these are all policies that impact that unity component of the tribal health wheel. But ICWA is something we still have in place today. And it actually was challenged not too long ago by, at the Supreme Court level. It was challenged as being a race-based law, and it's actually tied to, there's a political relationship with tribes that are beyond race. You know, it's a political distinction. We're a distinct political group. We're just not a race to be considered. And so, that was something that was challenged recently as well, all the way up to the Supreme Court level. Fortunately, they upheld that. It was you know, the response of that was during the 50s and 60s, there was what they called the 50s scoop or the 60s scoop. Yes. That's a great question. You know, I think that if it would probably start back in the core of the Constitution in some ways. Native Americans were prominently, the prominent wording was merciless Indian savages. And so they viewed Native people as an inferior race, as subhuman or so much different. And it didn't pluralize, you know, the same way as it did for other folks in the country. But, you know, with the highest rate of service in the military, and you know, many of my uncles, probably honestly almost all of my uncles, served in some form or branch of government, and that was because they were fighting for their country. You know, this was before America. This was their country. You know, and so when we talk about them being the first Americans, that's really what we mean. And so the challenges that they are continuing to face in our country, which is the greatest country on earth, you know, we can't forget our country's first Americans. Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. History, what do you do, right, Scott? We did have the Indian Education Act, which was something that came about to, again, help address the education disparities. So through the process of colonization throughout the country and on that timeline, there was the treaties that were made oftentimes included health, education, housing, employment. There were multiple things that were layered into a treaty. None of them were upheld. All of them were broken. All 500 treaties that ever existed, none of them were held. But we also see a place like Dallas became an urban site for relocation programs. And so the program was to move natives from reservation communities into urban centers with the promise of housing, education, employment. Well, very quickly, those did not materialize for the people that relocated here, and this was the 50s and 60s, and they really didn't have any way to get back home. And so you end up with urban clusters of Native Americans. So, Dallas, Denver, Phoenix, LA, New York, Minneapolis, you end up with these huge pockets of Native people there, but they're very diverse. And so, typically if I said somebody was Oglala Sioux, I wouldn't necessarily think they were from Dallas, or I wouldn't necessarily think they were from Long Beach, but part of that relocation program was something where they did move people out to different parts of the country. One of the policies that impact revenue, in 1988, it was a National Indian Gaming Act. And right now, currently, probably only about 15 to 16% of tribes that have gaming are successful, and not every tribe has gaming. And it's all about location, 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 right? I mean, if Dallas or Texas ever put a casino in between here and Durant or here in Choctaw, it's going to exponentially decrease the amount of traffic that goes up there. So it's location, location, location. If you were able to drop a pin and how big a circle you had to draw for 1 million people, think about the communities we serve, which are rural South Dakota. That circle's pretty big, right? Because there's not densely populated. Navajo Nation in the Four Corners area of the Southwest, it's really a big circle before you can get 1 million people within that circle. Someplace like Phoenix, it's a lot smaller circle, and so the tribes that are in and around those areas are doing a little bit better financially and with gaming. Shakopee, just outside of Minneapolis. Location, location, location. Seminole in Florida, Fort Lauderdale. I mean, you can't beat the location. That's where they're going to do well gaming. But there's a lot of rural communities that if they have a casino, it's really pretty small, or it's pretty modest, or there's not enough revenue to support all of their government programs. But that's the important part is even for my tribe, we do have a gaming facility, and it has been able to improve exponentially the quality of life for our reservation. So we've been able to build elder housing. We've been able to fund early childhood education programs. We put the money and reinvested into our community for roads, for bridges, for infrastructure, and for apartments. So we're using that money in the community. The state of Kansas would have you believe that they don't get any revenue from it, and they'd have you think that there's no revenue sharing plan, but there's maybe no direct payment, like we're not paying money directly to the state of Kansas, but there are still state taxes. All the shopping that still takes place at your local, Walmart, Home Depots, those are not on reservation businesses. They're buying homes outside of the county off the reservation. They're buying vehicles. They're paying for kids in their school programs. So there's a lot of indirect money that is going to these communities, even though it may be not just a cut straight off the top. And each community has their own compact. So each tribe, each reservation will have their own compact with the state on how those funds are used and whether or not state gaming allows it. We do talk about this history of impact on mental health. And even this year, the APA had put out an apology letter that really kind of apologized for all the harms done to Native peoples. And in particular, we talk about this example. I use this example when we talk about the boarding school era. From 1887 to about 1934, and even up into the 1950s, there was a boarding school era for Native Americans. There were over 350 boarding schools in the United States. A lot of them were run by religious organizations. But that whole process was meant to assimilate Native Americans to a mainstream culture. And so in that way, obviously, they would strip them of their native tongue, try to strip them of their culture, food, all of those things would be changed. And so that was the impact that took place for multi-generation. So even within my own family, my great-grandmother went to Chilocco Indian School, which is in Oklahoma, and my grandmother went to Haskell Indian Nations Institute when it was an institute. My mother and the rest of my family, we have a legacy at Haskell. And so Haskell started in 1887 as a boarding school. So it was one of the ones like Pratt's boarding school, Kill the Indian, Save the Man out of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It was very similar to that, but it was in Lawrence, Kansas. And so that process of deculturalization has this, it's a long effect. It has a long arc over history, over generations, over who it affected and how it impacted them. And so we're still seeing recovery from that trauma today. There's more discussion about it, more studies being done, but there is a deep tie to the food. There's a deep tie to health equity and nutrition. This was one of our old slides where we're going to do some question and answer. I'm going to skip through these. I mentioned briefly that the water is a huge factor in some of our communities. In Navajo, we have communities we work with that spend hours a day driving to haul water. They don't have clean water at their homes, so they have to drive up to 2 hours one direction to fill one of those agricultural containers in the back of the truck, haul it back home, use it, go back and get another batch. And they do that, several times a day, several trips a day. So during pandemic, when this discussion about, hum for the birthday song and wash your hands for 2 minutes, it's just unrealistic. They didn't have that sort of water to consume or to use in that way, which the impact of COVID on our communities was pretty high. There are different projects and programs, and I seen a stat from, I believe it was IHS, where they estimated maybe a 500 million to 700 million in order to get communities connected. And I can tell you it's going to be way more than that. There's no way they'd be able to achieve it for that much. But again, our nation's first Americans, and you see what sort of $1 billion of stimulus are going outside of the country when we have those types of needs right here in our backyards, right here in our own country. There are several different cases that have made it to the Supreme Court level. Navajo Nation recently had a case that made it all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was kind of like a forked tongue approach, where they said, yes, you do have these rights, but no, we have no way to help you enforce them. And so it's like, okay, you're telling the communities that they do have rights to water, but you're not going to assist with ensuring that they have those rights. So water rights, in environmental science or environmental rights in Indian country, it's a whole section of law that really emerged, as the colonization or as westward expansion really took place. Access to minerals, from they call it from heaven to hell. It's like you got the water rights from the air all the way down to the oil in the ground. It's like, what are the rights that go along with land ownership? So one of the biggest challenges are that access to foods. Many of our communities, again, it's at least 2 hours away from a grocery store. Some of the things that are more immediately available are hyper-processed foods. And so the chips, the sodas, the soft drinks, those are all types of things that we don't deliver as part of our programming. is we don't want to put those, encourage that in the communities, because we know that there is a predisposition for diabetes, hypertension, heart disease. So we work really hard with making sure that the access is dependable, to increase food insecurity, and to help with the food deserts that are in the communities as well. You know, Navajo Nation is about the size of West Virginia, and it only has 13 grocery stores. And I recently heard 12, so I don't know if maybe one closed recently. And so if they're not able to access it there and they have to travel off reservation, then they're going to a border town. And those border towns oftentimes mark things up on prices. And then we saw this during pandemic, the shelves would be empty. You know, they would be out of product. So some of the signs and symptoms of food insecurity, you know, we talk about these oftentimes, and I was reflecting on this list, you know, not eating for a whole day, eating less than they feel like they needed, just still being hungry, eating smaller meals. And I guess I didn't realize when I was young I might have been food insecure, because it's like, hey, I remember that. This was like this in our own home. You know, as growing up, we were on public assistance. We had food stamps. We were in public housing. And it wasn't until I get a little older that I was like, oh, well, maybe we were food insecure. You know, I mean, my family and my parents, my grandparents just did the best they could do. You don't know any different when you're a kid, but I guess as you get a little bit older, you can reflect on what some of those challenges might have been for them during that era. So as definition, we have even food insecurity is broken down into these 3 different levels, marginal, low, and very low. And it's really that precursor to hunger. And so we, through our programming, we make sure to have shelf-stable foods ready for delivery and to get those out to the communities as needed. Where is that most prevalent? Typically with minority populations. Again, the location. The communities we serve are some of the most rural, reservation, geographically challenged communities. So they're the ones that are going to have the most challenges with food security. But we also are working with program partners in those communities to strengthen their food programs. Also with gardening projects and those types of things that we see available too. So it's kind of sad, but you know, 1 in 4 families are food insecure. So about 25% of the families we have are food insecure. Fresh produce is very scarce on the reservation. So we've had a few very successful projects where we've been able to deliver and distribute just fresh produce. And so it's corn, it's potatoes, it's onions, it's carrots, it's celery. You know, we take these into communities and just do a huge, we did one recently with the northern 8 pueblos outside of Albuquerque in New Mexico. And it was just a huge success. I mean, we had folks from all over that area coming in to get food, and you know, a lot of stuff they hadn't had access to in a while, but they're able to definitely put it to good use. This is a really long quote for colonization disruptive native foodways. Essentially, I'll break it down real quick. The structure of colonization purported to change everything about Indian country. So there was this attack on the native foodways. There was an attack on children, with the boarding school era. And so when you have those levels of disruption and it's continuous, then there was a creation of dependency upon the government for their commodity programs. And those programs were all really high in processed flours. And so we talk about the Navajo tacos that came out of that, Indian tacos. They're delicious, I love them, but they're extremely unhealthy, and in some ways, in many ways, it was survival food. These were foods that came out of an era where they were using what they had at their disposal in order to make ends meet. And so trying to get back and undo some of that is that healing trauma that we're currently engaged with. Some of the work I've done with Lutheran Indian Ministries is a healing trauma program, but even the things like putting food programming, food sovereignty, food reclamation, language preservation, all of those things back into a community really helps them strengthen who they are, where they came from, know their history, have that connection with Creator, and really build better lives. So impact, I'm gonna go through some of these kind of quick. I wanna leave some time for questions. So again, as I mentioned, some of the things that we're doing to decrease this gap, we did our tribal food distributions. One of our innovative programs that we've done is we brought in native chefs. And so native chefs that know how to prepare traditional foods. And so they're able to bring back some of those recipes. And we have some really neat resources, recipe cards put together on how to do a buffalo or bison roast. You know, how to make one of those that's just delicious, mouth-watering, and nutritious. And then we have different restaurants that are popping up. Sean Sherman, who's known as the Sous Chef out of Minneapolis, has a restaurant that's amazing. Tokabe is located out of Denver. Native Foods, it's amazing. They actually deliver and have an online resource now. And so there are these different pockets and different individuals that are bringing this to the forefront. Melinda Emmert has a kombucha program out of Kansas, Morning Light Kombucha. It's delicious, you know, so they're really expanding into all these different areas, and we want to support those. And so if we can support these different ancestral gardens, foraging sessions, community gardens, then those are types of places where we can invest some of our money. Again, like I said, it's a dual approach with the serving immediate need, where PWNA is able to, you know, really showcase and get what you need on a daily basis, emergency style situations, but supporting long-term solutions. So we have two different arms of our program, and the supporting long-term solutions is developing those chefs and local leadership. This is a Chef Inyan Eagle Elk, and he has a bowl of Three Sisters soup that he made. Again, it's one of our programming. He's one of our native chefs, and we also have a recipe card that outlines that. There are other leaders in this industry. A guy named Thosh Collins. He's a kind of a health and fitness influencer. He wears a glucose monitor, and he's doing all his research on himself, essentially, and looking at how traditional native foods are impacting his overall health and well-being. So it's really kind of an innovative approach to take, where he's his own laboratory, but he's showing that it has the longitudinal improvement to his entire being. You know, the proteins that he's eating from elk and venison and natural foods, sweet potatoes, and those types of things. It's really amazing to see the work that he's done. Again, we do have an emergency response program for this, and we're going to continue to support, you know, these food sovereignty initiatives. It's really one of our strongest programs right now, and I know we'll continue to support the area and watch it grow. I'm probably close to time, so I want to make sure I leave a few time for questions. If you're interested in following us on any of our socials, help us spread the word. Get the word out there, share. Like I was telling Scott, we don't know which like, share, tweet, retweet, exit, is going to make a big difference for us, but we're, primarily a donations-based organization. So, we have a need for shelf-stable food and water. So if somebody is able to help us, get multiple pallets of water, we can appreciate that. If somebody wants to fund one of these programs for a leadership development cohort, we'd appreciate that, and we just don't know who or how, but join us to become more Native aware. Log on to our website, www.nativepartnership.org. We do have lots of different free resources. So we have a download about the boarding school era. We have a download about ICWA. We have a download about the first Thanksgiving. And so different resources there. They're free. Please use them and share them as you see fit. Are there any questions?
Yes.
Thank you, Joshua. Sorry. It's like drinking water from a fire hydrant, right? It's a lot.
So if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, I'll bring you the mic, and then you can ask it so everyone can hear it. But please, who wants to ask a question?
Mitch Maxted, Round Rock, Texas. Just interested to know, is there a website that you can go to find out, like put in a zip code and it will tell you, traditionally this was so-and-so's territory, Native
Sure.
American territory? Or...
Yeah, it was a Whose Land Am I On? And I think if you probably Googled that, or it does have some resources there. And you can, exactly what you said, type in a zip code and it can show a map, or it can help kind of pinpoint all the tribes that might have been in that area. And there's some overlap. So like even for this area, we've seen overlap of Comanche and Kiowa and Kickapoo, and it kind of depends on what era and what time of year. Because the tribal people were a lot more migratory. They weren't necessarily. I think they would get together every now and then in a place like Dallas. It seemed like a real natural meeting place. But they would also extend to other areas of the country. Whose land am I on? Yeah.
And I would just add to that here in Fort Worth, we're on the homelands of the Wichita-affiliated tribes. Caddo,
Yep.
Which were located more in East Texas, but also we're kind of at the boundary of the Caddo Nation. The Wichita and affiliated tribes goes from roughly what is Kansas down to about central Texas. They were violently removed from Texas. Dallas-Fort Worth was founded on the violent removal of Native peoples because once they were removed here by General Edward Tarrant and Captain John B. Denton, within 6 months, white settlers were moving into their homelands and taking it and creating the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Another question? Yes.
Thank you. Mine's not so much a question as a comment. This morning we heard a wonderful presentation interrelating colonization and neoliberal capitalism and ways to think about resisting those forces that have historically fragmented communities and destroyed identities. And your work, I think, is undoing trying to undo some of the damage of that colonizing neoliberal capitalist system. And it's giving me a lot of hope to see a community that's revitalizing language and culture and food and health and water access and creating cultural forms, specific forms of spirituality for the good of the people. And so this morning's conversation was could have been dispiriting, even though realistic and important. And your work this afternoon is a beautiful example of ways to resist that and reform communities, bring people back together to find themselves in important ways again. So thank you for that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's important, and I've talked with Scott about this several times, is we can identify a problem, but we got to identify a solution. Otherwise, then we're stuck in the problem. And so there are some really innovative things going on in Indian country, and I would tell you that there's an association called the Native Inspired Schools Program, NACA Inspired Schools, and they are essentially they're setting up immersion schools, like a magnet school, but in a tribal community. And so it's one of those where we won't know the true impact of that, but we feel like the trajectory is going to go really high because we're impacting the littlest kids. And so they're actually teaching them how to be more respectful of each other and respond better to each other at an earlier age, to address each other with respect and appropriately. And if you start with them when they're young, you think that as they mature to adults, they're going to be more responsible adults as well. And so they're incorporating, native language, native thought, native practices into their school programming. And so far, they're showing that they are on par with any of the state standards necessary. And so there's a lot of really innovative and hopeful work that's taking place in Indian country. Yeah, you bet.
Somebody else?
Hi, my name is Zara Ahmad. I go to TCU, and I'm doing a story actually on this for TCU 360. And I had a question, kind of just wanted to know, how does your work with, or how does TCU contribute to working with Native American students? And maybe you could probably answer this a little bit better. I'm not sure either person would want to take the question. And how important is it to include Native Americans, Indigenous people in campus activities, and why is it important for TCU students to attend events like this?
Well, I think a number of different reasons, and it shows support. I mean, some solidarity and community. There's nothing principally different, and these are healthy things to stand on. And so, in many ways, Native communities need to know, because we can be, this area, I think there's 40,000 Native Americans, 80,000 Native Americans between the Dallas-Fort Worth area. They're your neighbors. They're school teachers. They work in police stations. They're in elevator industry. I mean, they're your neighbors. And so if you can stand with people and you're side by side, it lets them know that there is that level of support and community. So that way we're not viewed as outside of the community, but we're part and ingrained in the fabric of the community. And what I've seen TCU do, and they do have a scholarship program that's going to be available this next year for 2 scholarships for Native students, to bring them here and to get them immersed into the culture, into the TCU culture. And so I think that level of sharing is being open to maybe a little bit of differing views or opinions, but you still have the civility to be able to have these discussions, and it doesn't, again, these aren't people that are from a different world. These are our country's first Americans. So I think it's very important to be inclusive in that sense, because there's rarely a story about American history that doesn't have a tie into Indian country. We talk about Iwo Jima. There were natives that were raising that flag at Iwo Jima. I mean, it's, name a civil rights era. We have the tribal college movement, Indian civil rights era and self-determination. There's just this thread, and that's who we are as a country. It's part of our fabric. So you can't talk about it without including, a whole community or population. We may not be as visible as we once were, and we are constantly fighting erasure. So we can appreciate when Martin Scorsese comes out with Killers of the Flower Moon. It puts a big light on American history for the Osage people. That's deeply tied into this country. And so, whether it comes through pop culture or good old American history, there is a tie and a bind into being part of the community.
Can I just add to that at TCU, as you know, it's overwhelmingly white, and it's even more overwhelmingly non-native. So TCU is pumping out every semester lots of non-native students who are going to be doctors and teachers and lawyers and whatever. They need to know how to work with Native communities, because every inch of the land that they will walk on in the United States is Native American territory, every single inch. There are Native communities that are still alive, still functioning, Native nations, not just communities, nations, who are still here. So knowing how to deal with Native patients, Native students, Native institutions, organizations is really vital to TCU students. So if we can educate them about how do you work with Native, how do you understand Native peoples, how do you not do certain things, it will make them better at their job. And then
you hit the nail on the head. I think the advocacy portion, because any field that you look at, what the percentage of Native American is in law, less than 1% of Native attorneys are Native, or less than 1% of attorneys are Native American. So again, we need advocates that understand our communities, whatever profession you're in. And so I think that's a great point, and that's going to be at school boards, to county, to state legislatures. There are going to be these things that crop up every so often, and to not know, then you're just not informed, or you're not educated. You haven't taken the time to learn that aspect. And in some communities, the Native vote could swing an election. There's enough Native voters out there that if there wasn't when we talk about elections being won by 500 or 600 people, 600 votes, 1,000, 6,000. Some of the communities have large numbers of voting populations. It could be an untapped resource in a lot of ways for politics, professionals, businesses. I think there's just a lot of opportunity in Indian country that could make it better for everybody. And so having those advocates at this level, to me, is critically important.
And I would just also say that history matters. And so TCU just finished celebrating its 150th anniversary. For most of TCU's 150 years, its relationships with Native Americans is probably what you would expect it to be. It's bad. TCU has been the purveyor of stereotypes and misinformation and other harmful actions against Native peoples. Oftentimes doing it, I think, without knowing, just because it was part of its bigger culture, but that's no excuse, especially for a university, to not know that. It's only been about since 2015 that TCU has started paying attention to its relationships with Native peoples. That's pretty late. TCU has come light years from where it was in 2015, but it still has a long way to go. And the other thing I will say about that is TCU has 3 immediate problems or issues that it has to deal with in developing healthy relationships with Native peoples. And those 3 things are Texas Christian University. Those are 3 of the most destructive forces in Native people's lives, and TCU combined them into their name. So we have to do a lot of work to overcome just the name because of all the heritage and baggage that brings, but that's a whole nother session. So, yes.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. One, I've noticed in the last few decades more and more Indian health clinics being built on reservations. Are they making any difference?
Yes, I would say they are. In particular, so you have 2 models of operation. One is the IHS, Indian Health Services Clinic. The other is when it's called, when a tribe can 638, PL 638. So the tribe essentially gets a pot of money to run their own clinic. And you're starting to see the success when the tribes are running their own clinic. The really rigid IHS model that's underfunded, understaffed, it isn't working very well. And so the other model with the tribally owned and operated, they're able to incorporate traditional values, holistic medicines, so they are becoming a little bit more, they're getting healthier. Yeah.
Okay. The other is the Disciples of Christ, Christian Church Disciples of Christ. This is my bias. I mean, we've kind of run out of steam trying to do any kind of effective advocacy or ministry for Native Americans. So I'm really curious that you're working with the Lutheran Church, ELCA?
Yes.
Yeah. What are the priorities for the ELCA? What are they doing that is helpful?
So through the Lutheran Indian Ministries and ELCA, we've kind of been, it's been a little mixed, because in some ways it's like we don't qualify as a Lutheran organization, but sometimes we do qualify as a Lutheran organization. So I think there's a level of politics that I don't really understand, and we don't get into. But with our board, we're doing Healing the Wounds of Trauma, which is a program done in Native communities to do exactly what it says, healing the wounds of trauma by incorporating Christ. And so it's taken place in Alaska, Montana, and like that northern tier of the country is really where that is now. And so Lutheran Indian Ministries was a Canadian organization, so the bridge over to Native peoples in Canada was a primary focus for some time, because there's a lot of similarity in history and treatment with residential schools in Canada, boarding schools in the United States. So as much as I would say they are very helpful or supporting us, they haven't been very supportive. And I think it has to do with, like, they made some really wonky rule changes where maybe 100% of your board had to be Lutheran. And so if I'm Baptist, but I'm on the Lutheran Indian Ministry Board, I don't count, or I disqualify us. And so, to me that's a huge political mistake at that level. I don't. So I'm not into that. Yeah.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Anybody? Okay, then I will ask, can you just sort of quickly clarify a little bit more this distinction between Native peoples as nations versus a race?
Sure.
The political versus racial distinction, and why that's so important.
So the reason why that's really important, and in many ways, the initial relationship between tribes and the 13 original colonies, right? There was more of this, an agreement between equals, where the power dynamic that existed. And so treaties were created, and it was viewed as an agreement between equals, two sovereign nations that have come together to make a treaty. So that's where it starts. That's where our history starts as Native people, to be true political distinct differences, and so where the race card came into it, or how that got played, clearly, race does have a little bit to do with the political nature of it, but it isn't what guides it. And so these rulings that came about through the course of federal Indian law, even as early as the Johnson trilogy, Worcester v. Johnston, Cherokee Nation v. Johnson, or Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, and Johnson v. McIntosh, all of these were really delineating, is this a race of people, or are they political sovereigns? And so that relationship that was created, in some ways it became this domestic dependent nation. And so they deemed tribes as conquered people, and so they were domestic dependent on the United States for these things. And so the relationship then now, it keeps that intact. And so even reservation communities, land ownership, it's very different than regular land ownership. Like on a reservation, you can't freely buy and sell land. And so we know land is one of the biggest wealth engines for people, in the United States. However, for a tribal member, you can't buy or sell your land. You can't leverage that with a bank to get a loan or any of those types of things. It's held in trust by the government. So that's where all these trust relationship comes in to reliance and dependency on the federal government. And so we've never been just categorized as a race. We've always had this distinct political relationship, whether it's with all the various Indian policies, and it was a Supreme Court pendulum shifting back and forth of assimilation, termination, self-determination. You have these big swings of policy towards Native Americans, and that doesn't normally just happen on a race-based continuum, but it's these even at the state level, at the county level, that political relationship between those communities are really where it's tied together. That's the nexus.
And so someone like you, you're a citizen of two nations, the United States and the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and our community doesn't do it, but like the Haudenosaunee, they are out of New York, and they have their Iroquois Confederacy. They have their own passport. My tribe doesn't issue our own passport. I think we got into doing our own driver's licenses, but we don't have our own passport yet. Any sovereign nation could do that, but technically, yes, I'd be a dual citizen, dual citizenship. Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a lot more we'd like to talk about, but we have to go. So let's give a round of applause. Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.
And I think my last responsibility as presider is to remind you that there is a 3 o'clock session, so be on top of that. Okay, thank you very much.